January 25, 2006. North London. Bailiffs forced open the door of a small bedsit flat above Wood Green shopping city. What they found would haunt them forever. The television was still flickering. The heating was on. Christmas presents sat neatly wrapped on the floor. And on the bed lay the skeletal remains of a woman, long dead, unnoticed for over 2 years. How could a person vanish in the middle of a city, surrounded by millions, and no one even realized she was gone? If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's rewind. To understand how Joyce Carol Vincent reached this moment, we need to go back, piece by piece, through the life of a woman who disappeared long before she ever died. The door creaked open with resistance, as if the very air inside the small bedsit had grown heavy over time, pressing back against the outside world that had long forgotten it. For the men tasked with entering, this was supposed to be routine. Bailiffs, repossessing a flat because of unpaid rent. Nothing unusual in a city where eviction notices and overdue accounts were just another part of the daily grind. But what they stumbled into on that cold January afternoon in 2006 was anything but ordinary. The television was still on. Its glow danced across the room, flickering with images of soap operas and commercials, as if someone might return any moment to settle in and watch. The heating hummed softly, battling the winter chill. On the floor sat carefully wrapped Christmas presents, untouched, their shiny paper now dulled with time. And there, lying quietly on the bed, was what was left of Joyce Carol Vincent. Her body had collapsed into itself, reduced to a skeletal frame, the kind of discovery that freezes breath in your lungs. She had been there for over 2 years. 2 years. While life outside surged forward, birthdays celebrated, buses rattling down the street, lovers breaking up and reconciling, offices opening and closing, Joyce remained here, undisturbed, fading into silence while the world carried on without her. How does something like this even happen? How does a woman in one of the busiest cities in the world vanish so completely that no one, not neighbors, not friends, not even family, comes knocking? This is where Joyce's story begins to unravel, not with her death, but with the slow and invisible process of disappearing while still alive. Joyce was not the kind of person you'd expect to vanish. People remembered her as radiant, magnetic even. She had once moved among musicians, professionals, friends who swore she lit up every room she entered. She wasn't some recluse who had always hidden away from the world. Quite the opposite, she had once belonged to it. She had been there, in the thick of it, smiling, laughing, making connections. But somewhere along the way those connections frayed and Joyce began to pull back. Like threads unraveling from a sweater, one tie at a time loosened until the whole thing came undone. By the time her body was discovered, she had already performed the most tragic of vanishing acts, slipping out of the lives of everyone she once knew, unnoticed. The last confirmed trace of Joyce was in December 2003. No one knows the exact date she died, but the most chilling detail is how seamlessly the world carried on without realizing she was gone. The half-paid rent, covered automatically by housing benefits, fooled the landlord. The ever-blaring television drowned suspicion. Neighbors assumed the flat was empty, or if they noticed the faint smell of decomposition, they attributed it to nearby bins. The noise of Wood Green shopping city masked everything else. And so, for 25 months, Joyce's absence wasn't absence at all. It was invisible. But what makes this story more than just a tragic headline is that Joyce wasn't a ghost before she died. She had a life, a complicated, layered one, filled with early promise, hidden struggles, and quiet suffering. She had family who once loved her deeply. She had friends who thought she was unforgettable. She had jobs that placed her in the heart of London's financial world. She even had fleeting brushes with history, like the time she attended the Nelson Mandela tribute concert in 1990, shaking the hand of the man who had become a symbol of global hope. And yet, none of that saved her from the crushing weight of isolation. None of it stopped her from becoming the woman no one noticed was gone. This is the paradox at the center of her story. How could someone who once stood in the glow of friendship, opportunity, and even global moments, slip away into the kind of silence that lasts years? To understand that, you have to look beyond the shocking discovery of her body and begin to trace the slow erosion of her ties to the world. Imagine for a moment what those final weeks in December 2003 might have been like for Joyce. The world outside buzzing with Christmas lights, shoppers crowding into the mall beneath her flat, people laughing over drinks and hurriedly buying last-minute gifts. And there she was, alone, sick, maybe gasping for breath from an asthma attack or doubled over from the pain of a bleeding ulcer. Around her were Christmas presents, neatly wrapped, suggesting she hadn't fully given up on connection. Perhaps they were for a family she no longer spoke to. Perhaps for someone she loved or once loved. Or maybe they were her way of holding on to the ritual of belonging, even if there was no one left to receive them. Those gifts are what haunt people most. They whisper of intention, of hope, of someone still trying right up until the end. But then silence. Joyce's body stilled. And the silence stretched on into weeks, then months, then years. Her story shocks us because it challenges the way we think about cities, about community, about human connection. London isn't some isolated village where a disappearance might go unnoticed. It's a city of millions, a place where lives bump into one another daily. And yet, here was proof that you could be surrounded by people and still be profoundly alone. Joyce's death forces us to ask, how many people do we walk past every day not realizing the battles they're fighting behind closed doors? How many faces we see on buses, in supermarkets, at work, might be silently unraveling, retreating, vanishing before our eyes? In the coming chapters, we'll go back to where it all began. We'll look at Joyce's childhood, her early rise, the shadows of abuse, and the slow but steady retreat into invisibility. Because Joyce Carol Vincent didn't just vanish in 2003, she had been disappearing, piece by piece, long before that. Her story is not just about the day she was found. It's about the long, quiet journey that brought her there. And that is what makes it so haunting. Every story has roots. And to understand how Joyce Carol Vincent could one day vanish so completely, we need to go back, not to the tragic discovery in 2006, but to the earliest chapters of her life. Because long before she closed her door and would grin for the last time, Joyce had already been shaped by shadows that followed her from childhood. Joyce was born on October 19, 1965, in Hammersmith, London, to parents who had come to Britain from the Caribbean island of Grenada. Her father, Lawrence, was of African descent. Her mother, Lyris, was of Indian descent. Together they built a modest life in a new country, raising 5 daughters, of which Joyce was the youngest. To be the youngest of 5 might sound like a blessing. Surrounded by older sisters, Joyce should have had layers of protection, love, and guidance. And in many ways she did. But her childhood would prove to be far from secure. The first shadow fell when Joyce was only 11 years old. That was when her mother, Lyris, died. At an age when most children are still clinging tightly to their parents, Joyce had the rug pulled out from under her. Suddenly, the one figure who might have given her consistency, warmth, and emotional grounding was gone. Her 4 older sisters stepped in, taking on the responsibility of raising her. They became her guardians, her makeshift anchors. But siblings, no matter how well-meaning, cannot always replace the irreplaceable. A mother's absence leaves a hole that nothing quite fills, and for Joyce, that absence would echo through the rest of her life. Her father, Lawrence, was still alive. But by most accounts he was emotionally distant. Joyce reportedly described him later as cold, unavailable, the kind of man who provided in material ways but rarely in emotional ones. She even told people that he had died years before he actually did, an act that reveals just how severed she felt from him. When he truly did pass in 2004, he never knew that Joyce had predeceased him. That's how fractured their relationship had become. As a child, Joyce was intelligent but restless. She attended Melcombe Primary School and later Fulham Gilead School for Girls. Yet she left school at 16 with no qualifications, something that might have set her on a trajectory of limited opportunities. Still, she carried herself with charisma, bright, engaging, capable of making friends easily. She wasn't destined to be invisible, at least not yet. But here's the thing about childhood trauma. It doesn't always show itself immediately. It lingers beneath the surface, like cracks in a foundation that only become visible when the weight above grows too heavy. The death of her mother, the emotional distance of her father, and the burden placed on her siblings to raise her, these were the first fractures. And they mattered. Because later, when Joyce began to withdraw from the world, when she started cutting ties with her family, when she slipped into isolation, those decisions weren't born in a vacuum. They were rehearsed long before, in the loneliness of a little girl who lost her mother too soon and never truly felt tethered to her father. But childhood wasn't all sorrow. Joyce grew up in London during a vibrant, transformative era. The late 1960s and 70s saw waves of cultural shifts, music, fashion, politics, all of which left their imprint. As the youngest child, Joyce was often caught between two worlds, her Grenadian heritage at home and the British culture pressing in from outside. Her sisters described her as charming, sometimes stubborn, often ambitious. She wanted to live life fully, to stand out. And in her 20s she did exactly that. But even during these early years, there was a sense that Joyce was searching for something she couldn't quite name. Acceptance, maybe, or safety. Perhaps both. Think about the weight of losing a mother at 11. Children that age are old enough to understand death, but too young to carry it gracefully. It leaves scars. For Joyce, the loss likely reinforced the feeling that nothing in life was permanent, that people could vanish without warning, that love, even when present, might not last. And when you add in a father who felt more like a stranger than a comfort, the effect compounds. Joyce grew up with both presence and absence, sisters who cared but were not parents, a father who was alive but distant, and a mother who was gone but whose absence filled every room. These are the shadows Joyce carried forward. They are not the whole story, but they are the groundwork for it. Because when we later see her cutting off her family, when we watch her walk away from jobs, friends, and connections, it's tempting to think she simply chose isolation. But choices don't happen in a vacuum. They are echoes of earlier patterns, earlier wounds. There's another layer to consider: race and identity. As a child of Grenadian immigrants, Joyce grew up in a Britain that wasn't always welcoming. The 1960s and 70s were turbulent years for race relations in the UK. Being of Douglas descent, mixed African and Indian heritage, meant navigating multiple identities and at times not fitting neatly into any. This dual heritage gave Joyce a unique beauty that others noticed, but it may also have left her feeling caught between worlds. Not fully this, not fully that. Identity confusion isn't unusual for children of immigrants, but coupled with the instability at home, it may have deepened Joyce's sense of being on the outside looking in. By the time Joyce reached adolescence, she already had the hallmarks of someone both bright and vulnerable. She wasn't doomed, far from it. She was lively, charming, often described as magnetic. She could walk into a room and make people want to be near her. But beneath that surface brightness lay the quiet truth of someone who had learned early on that people leave, ties break, and belonging can be fragile. And perhaps that's what made her early adulthood so striking. When she began to work in professional environments, when she mingled with musicians and cultural icons, she seemed to defy her beginnings. She looked like someone on the rise, someone who had transcended those early shadows. But shadows have a way of following. This chapter of Joyce's life is less about events and more about the shaping of her inner world. The mother she lost. The father she never felt close to. The sisters who raised her but could not fill the absence. The cultural pressures of growing up between two worlds. All of it quietly sculpted her, leaving behind invisible marks. And those marks mattered. Because later, when Joyce began the slow retreat into invisibility, when she cut off family ties, when she walked away from careers, when she hid in shelters and flats, it wasn't a sudden transformation. It was the continuation of a pattern laid down long before. The tragedy of Joyce Carol Vincent wasn't just that she died alone. It was that she lived with shadows from the very beginning, shadows that would follow her all the way to the end. By the time Joyce Carol Vincent reached her 20s, the shy little girl who had lost her mother was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the quiet child shaped by grief and absence. In her place stood a young woman who seemed to radiate light, charm, and possibility. To those who knew her during this period, Joyce wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was magnetic. There's a word her friends used often to describe her: unforgettable. She had a way of drawing people in, not just because of her striking beauty, though that was part of it, but because she carried herself with a kind of energy that made people want to stay close. Her smile lingered in your mind long after she left the room. She was funny, approachable, and effortlessly stylish, the kind of person who could walk into a party and instantly belong. This was the Joyce the world saw in her early adulthood. And for a time, it looked like the shadows of her childhood had been left far behind. In 1985, at just 20 years old, Joyce landed her first real job in London's financial world. She worked as a secretary at OCL, a shipping company in the heart of the City of London. It was hardly glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. From there, she moved through a series of increasingly reputable firms, C. Ito & Company Law Debenture, and eventually Ernst & Young, one of the world's largest accounting firms. At Ernst & Young, Joyce worked in the Treasury Department for 4 years. She was good at her job, efficient and capable, but what struck her colleagues most wasn't her work ethic. It was her presence. People remembered her as cheerful, always polished, someone who seemed to float above the ordinary stress of corporate life. She was liked, admired even, though she rarely let people see much beyond the surface. It's here that we start to notice the duality in Joyce's life. Outwardly, she was a rising professional with friends, laughter, and style. Inwardly, she was already learning to keep people at arm's length. Colleagues knew her, but they didn't know her. Friends spent time with her, but very few really understood her. Joyce was present, but also just out of reach. Outside of work, her world was bigger, brighter, and far more glamorous than most would imagine. Joyce had connections in the music industry, moving in circles that brought her into contact with artists and creative minds. She was seen backstage at concerts, mingling with musicians, producers, and insiders. The most iconic moment of this era came in April 1990, when she attended the historic Nelson Mandela, an international tribute for a free South Africa concert at Wembley Stadium. It was a cultural earthquake of an event, broadcast worldwide, with performances from some of the greatest musicians of the time. And there, among the sea of faces, Joyce stood in the backstage audience, captured on video. It said she even shook hands with Nelson Mandela himself. Pause for a moment and imagine that. A young woman in her mid-20s, radiant, living in the city, brushing shoulders with history itself. To anyone looking at her life in that moment, Joyce was not someone destined for obscurity. She was going places. She belonged to the world. Her friends during this time recall her as someone full of possibility. She was the kind of woman who, if you met her once, you didn't forget her. People described her as charming, magnetic, and stylish. She was not only attractive but also carried herself with a natural elegance. And yet, there was something else beneath the shine. Friends later recalled that Joyce was private, sometimes almost too private. She didn't share much about her inner struggles, and if she was hurting, she masked it behind her laughter. She had mastered the art of appearing okay, even when she wasn't. This ability to keep people at a distance, while at the same time making them feel close, was one of her defining traits. It made her captivating but also made her vulnerable. Because when the cracks in her life began to widen, few people were close enough to truly notice. What's remarkable about this chapter of Joyce's life is how much it contrasted with how her story would end. In her 20s, she seemed unstoppable. She had a career. She had connections. She had friends. She had moments most people only dream about, standing backstage at a Mandela tribute, mingling with the cultural elite. But behind that facade, the early shadows of her childhood had never really gone away. The girl who had lost her mother at 11, who had grown up with an emotionally absent father, was still inside her. And that girl had learned something dangerous: how to disappear in plain sight. By the late 1990s, Joyce's professional life looked stable. But stability can be deceptive. Though she was good at her job, she never seemed fully rooted in it. Perhaps she enjoyed the social element of work more than the work itself. Perhaps the corporate world wasn't where she truly wanted to be. Whatever the reason, in March 2001, Joyce did something no one expected. She resigned from Ernst & Young. There was no public explanation. No big announcement. One day she was simply gone. And this moment is important, because it marks the beginning of Joyce's slow retreat from the world. The rising star who once brushed hands with Nelson Mandela, who lit up every room she entered, who had colleagues and friends and opportunities, that woman began to pull back. Within months, Joyce would check into a women's shelter for survivors of domestic abuse. Within a year, she would start cutting ties with her family. Within 2 years, she would be living in near total isolation. But in her 20s, none of that was visible yet. Back then, Joyce seemed full of promise, a woman with a future. People saw her beauty, her charm, her connections, and assumed her story was only just beginning. The irony, of course, is that it was beginning, but not the way anyone expected. The tragedy of Joyce Carol Vincent isn't just that she died alone. It's that she lived 2 lives. One the world could see and one she kept hidden. In her 20s, the public life was dazzling: jobs, friends, music, history. But the private life was quieter, lonelier, carrying the weight of early shadows no one else could see. This is the paradox of Joyce's rising star years. She appeared to be ascending, moving higher, brighter, closer to something extraordinary. But underneath, the foundations were fragile. And when the cracks began to widen, everything she had built would slowly fall away. Because sometimes, the brightest lights burn out the fastest. For years, Joyce Carol Vincent seemed untouchable. She had the smile, the style, the connections, the kind of magnetic presence that turned heads and opened doors. But what most people didn't see, what they couldn't see, were the hairline fractures forming just beneath that polished surface. Every story that ends in tragedy begins with warning signs. They may not scream for attention at first, they whisper. They show up in subtle patterns, in choices that don't quite make sense, in silences that grow a little too long. And Joyce's story was no different. By the late 1990s, Joyce was in her early 30s. To her colleagues at Ernst & Young, she was dependable, efficient, a pleasant face in the office. To her friends in the music scene, she was vibrant, always around the edges of something exciting. To casual acquaintances, she was stylish, friendly, approachable. She looked like she was building a life with direction and momentum. But beneath that outward image, Joyce carried an unease that she rarely let slip. Those closest to her would later say that she never seemed entirely settled, never fully anchored. She could be cheerful one moment and distant the next. She knew how to be in a crowd without ever being truly known by it. Part of this came from her roots. Losing her mother at 11 had carved a wound she never truly healed. Having a father who seemed emotionally unavailable left her with questions about love and belonging. Joyce knew how to put on a brave face, how to charm, how to shine. But deep down, she was also someone who feared abandonment, who never felt entirely safe in the permanence of human relationships. And so, even as she thrived socially, she learned to keep people at a distance. Friends later remembered that she was incredibly private. She didn't talk about her feelings much, and if she was struggling, she was the last person to admit it. For all her warmth, Joyce kept her inner world carefully locked away. It's in this quiet secrecy that the first cracks appeared. Though she worked in respected companies, Joyce never pursued qualifications or higher education. She had left school at 16 with no certificates. In the professional world, charm and personality carried her far, but only so far. Without qualifications, her career had limits. Perhaps she sensed it. Perhaps she worried that one day the facade would crumble, and she would be exposed as not quite what people thought. Financially, too, things were less stable than they appeared. Joyce never seemed to secure lasting financial independence. She worked, yes, but she also moved between jobs. She never built the kind of security that could shield her from hardship. Friends recall that she lived more for the moment than for the future. She loved beautiful things, nice clothes, the appearance of success. But behind that, her footing was shakier than it looked. And then, there were her relationships. For a long time, Joyce was surrounded by friends, men and women who enjoyed her company. But at some point in the late 1990s, she entered a relationship that would prove damaging. Accounts from investigators and those who knew her suggest that she became involved with a man who was abusive. The details remain vague. Joyce never spoke publicly about it, and the few clues come from fragments of testimony. But what's clear is that something in this relationship shook her deeply. By 2001, Joyce was staying in a women's shelter for survivors of domestic abuse. For a woman who had once moved so confidently through the world, who had mingled with artists and professionals, this was a dramatic shift. To go from corporate offices to refuge shelters suggests not just hardship, but fear. Some say Joyce was ashamed. Ashamed to admit she had been a victim, ashamed to let her family or friends see how far she had fallen. Others believe she was hiding, not just emotionally but physically. That she wanted to disappear so that her abuser could not find her. Either way, the decision marked the beginning of her withdrawal from the world. Think about the gravity of that moment. In March 2001, Joyce resigned from Ernst & Young, a job that gave her structure, income, and identity. Shortly afterward, she walked into a women's shelter in Haringey, North London. It was a place for those who had nowhere else to go, who needed safety, anonymity, a shield from danger. For Joyce, who had once appeared so full of life, so promising, this was the start of a downward spiral. It wasn't obvious yet, not to neighbors, not to old colleagues, not even to family, but the cracks beneath the surface were widening. Her family, meanwhile, was beginning to notice her slipping away. Joyce's 4 older sisters had raised her after their mother's death. They had always tried to look out for her. But by the early 2000s, Joyce was reducing contact with them, letting phone calls go unanswered, visits lapse. She wasn't angry, not openly. There had been no explosive falling out. She simply detached. One source close to the investigation would later say, she detached herself from her family, but there was no bust up. They're a really nice family. We understand she was in a relationship and there was a history of domestic violence. That's the haunting part, there wasn't a single rupture. No moment anyone could point to and say this is when she cut ties. It was quieter, subtler, like sand slipping through fingers. One call missed. One visit postponed. One excuse after another. Until, eventually, Joyce wasn't there at all. This is the paradox of Joyce's story. In her early years she seemed so alive, so connected, so visible. And yet, beneath that was an undercurrent of fragility, secrecy, and isolation waiting to surface. Her charm was real, but it also served as a mask. Her social circles were wide but shallow. Her career was respectable but unsteady. And her relationships, at least one of them, left scars that made her retreat into herself. By the time she entered the shelter in 2001, Joyce was already on the path that would lead her to Wood Green, to a flat above a shopping center, to a death no one noticed for over 2 years. If you looked at her then, you might not have seen it. To the outside world, Joyce still looked like a woman with potential. She still smiled, still dressed well, still carried herself with grace. But the truth was darker. The cracks beneath the surface were no longer cracks. They were fault lines. And soon they would shift, breaking apart the carefully constructed facade of the rising star. There is a moment in every vanishing act when the silence becomes louder than words. For Joyce Carol Vincent, that silence began creeping in during the early 2000s. One by one, the connections that tethered her to the world loosened. A phone call missed here, a visit canceled there. And then, as if rehearsing an invisible exit, she slowly folded herself out of the picture. To her sisters, who had once been her protectors, Joyce's distance was puzzling at first, then worrying and finally heartbreaking. There had been no argument, no dramatic confrontation. She hadn't accused them of anything or cut them off with anger. Instead, she simply drifted. Imagine watching someone you love gradually fade into the background of your life, until you're no longer sure if they want to be found. Her sisters wrote letters. They phoned. They even hired a private investigator when her silence became unbearable. But Joyce didn't answer. She had vanished in plain sight. What drives someone to erase themselves? Shame? Fear? The need for control? For Joyce, it might have been all three. By this time, she had already spent time in a women's shelter, her pride bruised by the reality of abuse. In a society that still stigmatized victims, perhaps she felt too embarrassed to tell her family. Maybe she thought they would see her differently, that her independence would look like weakness, that the strong, smiling sister they remembered would be replaced in their eyes by a woman who had been hurt. Or maybe it was fear. If her abusers still haunted her steps, Joyce might have decided the only way to stay safe was to disappear, to cut every string that could be used to trace her. But there is another possibility: control. Life had dealt her trauma she couldn't prevent. Her mother's death, her father's distance, the unpredictable men she trusted. Perhaps withdrawing was her way of taking back power. To step out of everyone's reach is, in its own way, to assert independence. Friends in the music scene noticed the shift too. Once a familiar face at events, Joyce no longer appeared at the concerts and social gatherings where she had once thrived. Her phone stopped ringing with invites. People assumed she was busy, or maybe she had moved on to a new circle. No one imagined she was vanishing into isolation. At work, colleagues saw the same retreat. She resigned from Ernst & Young in 2001, a decision no one fully understood. She didn't leave for another opportunity. She didn't explain what was next. She just stepped away. For someone who had built a life of visibility and connection, this silence was strange. But silence has a way of multiplying. Once Joyce stopped talking to friends, once she stopped calling her sisters, once she stopped showing up to social gatherings, the silence grew heavier. Days without contact became weeks. Weeks became months. The longer she stayed away, the harder it became to return. What would she say? How could she explain her absence? So she stayed quiet. The tragedy of Joyce's silent retreat is that it was not marked by drama but by invisibility. She didn't slam doors or shout goodbyes. She just slipped away gently, like mist dissolving into air. And by the time anyone realized how far she had gone, she was already too deep in the shadows to call back. What's chilling is that the silence didn't raise alarms quickly enough. Joyce wasn't the kind of person who kept constant tabs on others, and in return, people didn't always keep constant tabs on her. In a busy city like London, it's easy to disappear. Neighbors may not know your name. Friends assume you're just busy. Families, hurt by rejection, convince themselves you need space. And so Joyce's retreat wasn't just personal, it was enabled by the city itself, by a culture that allows people to vanish without anyone truly noticing. This was the rehearsal for what was to come. The world was still moving, still buzzing with life, but Joyce was already beginning her silent retreat, stepping backward into the shadows where no one could follow. By February 2003, Joyce had reached the final stage of her retreat. She moved into a small bedsit above Wood Green shopping city in North London. From the outside, the building was unremarkable, just another housing block owned by the Metropolitan Housing Trust, used to shelter those escaping violence or hardship. But for Joyce, it was more than just a roof over her head. It was her fortress, her hiding place, her final refuge. The flat itself was compact, almost claustrophobic. A single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom tucked away, a window overlooking the bustle of the shopping center below. From inside, you could hear the muffled roar of the city, buses pulling in, footsteps echoing in the mall, the endless hum of life. And yet, within those walls, Joyce created silence. She was physically surrounded by people, but emotionally she was sealed off. Thousands of shoppers passed beneath her window each day, but none of them knew her name. None of them knew that behind the locked door of that flat lived a woman who was slowly cutting herself off from the world. What's haunting is how ordinary it all seemed. Joyce paid her rent through housing benefits, at least partially. Her television was plugged in, her heating worked, her bills were covered through automated systems. On paper she looked alive. In reality she was disappearing. Neighbors barely noticed her. Some thought the flat was empty. Others assumed the faint noises they heard were just the background sounds of city life. The building itself was noisy: televisions, radios, arguments, laughter. Nothing about Joyce's silence stood out. For Joyce, this anonymity might have been comforting. No questions. No expectations. No reminders of what she had lost. She could exist without scrutiny, without judgment, without pressure to explain herself. But the cost of that anonymity was devastating. The more invisible she became, the easier it was for the world to forget her. In November 2003, Joyce was admitted to North Middlesex Hospital after vomiting blood, the result of a peptic ulcer. For 2 days she lay in a hospital bed, vulnerable and ill. But when she was discharged, she didn't return to family or friends. She went back to the little flat above the shopping center. That decision, returning alone to isolation, feels like the final step in her retreat. Even illness, even danger, wasn't enough to pull her back toward others. Whether out of pride, shame, or fear, Joyce chose solitude. Imagine the scene inside her bedside in December 2003. Christmas lights glowing faintly in the distance. The sound of carols drifting faintly from the shopping center below. And in that small room, Joyce wrapping presents. Presents that would never be delivered, never opened. Who were they for? Family she had stopped speaking to? Friends she no longer called? Or were they for herself, a ritual of hope in the middle of her loneliness? Those wrapped presents would later be found beside her body. They would become symbols of a life paused mid-action, a story that ended before its final chapter could be written. And then, sometime in December 2003, Joyce died. Whether from an asthma attack or complications from her ulcer, no one knows for certain. What we do know is that she died alone, in that flat above the city, her television still flickering, her heating still running, her body collapsing quietly into the silence she had created. Outside, London moved on. Shoppers filled the mall. Buses pulled into the station. Life continued at full speed. And just one floor above, Joyce slipped out of the world unnoticed. Her death went undiscovered for over 2 years. 2 years in which her body lay in that flat, slowly decomposing, while the television played endlessly. 2 years in which neighbors assumed the smell came from rubbish bins. 2 years in which rent arrears piled up unnoticed because half her payments were covered by housing benefits. It is almost unthinkable. A young woman, only 38 years old, gone for over 2 years before anyone knocked on her door. But that is exactly what happened. The bedsit above the city was both her sanctuary and her coffin. A place where she thought she could disappear safely, but where she instead disappeared completely. January 25, 2006. For the bailiffs from the Metropolitan Housing Trust, it was supposed to be routine. A simple repossession. Just another address on their long list of tenants who had fallen behind on rent. The flat was a one-bedroom bedsit, perched above the bustling wood green shopping city in North London. From the outside, it looked ordinary, indistinguishable from the other units stacked along the block. A metal door, double-locked. Windows obscured. The kind of place you walk past without giving it a second thought. But behind that door lay a secret no one had dared to imagine. The arrears had been building for years. More than £2,000 in unpaid rent, a sum the housing trust could no longer ignore. What they didn't know was that housing benefits had continued to cover half the rent long after Joyce's death, masking the true length of her absence. It was only once the balance became too glaring to overlook that they decided to take action. And so, on that winter morning, bailiffs arrived at the flat, tools in hand, ready to force their way in. The first thing that hit them was the silence. In a building alive with the constant hum of televisions, arguments, and footsteps, the silence of Joyce's flat was suffocating. No sound of movement inside. No shuffle of feet to the door. Only the faint buzz of a television, its glow leaking through the thin crack around the frame. They knocked. Nothing. They knocked again. Still nothing. With a heavy breath, one of the men inserted the crowbar, wedged it against the lock and forced the door open. What they saw would haunt them. The air rushed out in a wave of rot. A smell so thick it clung to the back of their throats, forcing them to cover their mouths. It was not the musty scent of damp or dust. It was sharper, heavier, unmistakable, the smell of human decay. Inside, the television was still blaring. For 2 years, it had played endlessly, the screen now faintly burned from overuse. The heating hummed softly in the background, filling the room with an unnatural warmth. And on the floor, surrounded by shopping bags and wrapped Christmas presents, lay Joyce Carol Vincent, or what was left of her. Her remains were skeletal, unrecognizable at first glance. She had been dead for over 2 years, her body slowly collapsing into itself. Only the outlines of her presence remained, the curve of her spine, the fragments of her clothing, the still-wrapped gifts that suggested she had been preparing for a celebration she would never see. The bailiffs froze. This was not what they had come for. Police were called immediately. Paramedics too, though there was nothing to be done. Detectives stepped carefully into the room, cataloging everything. The television remote lay on the floor beside her. The Christmas presents were neat, untouched, gathering dust. A shopping bag leaned against the wall, as though she had just returned from an errand and sat down to rest. The door had been double-locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. Whatever had happened to Joyce, it hadn't been violent. The most likely explanation? Natural causes, an asthma attack, a complication from her peptic ulcer. But still, the question rang louder than any medical theory. How could a woman die in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world, and no one noticed for more than 2 years? For the investigators, the scene was almost surreal. A flat frozen in time. Bills still being paid through automated systems. A television endlessly flickering. Rent partially covered by housing benefits. And beneath it all, the unthinkable reality that a life had ended here in silence, and the city had moved on without blinking. Outside, shoppers bustled in and out of stores, carrying bags, making plans, laughing at jokes. Just a floor above, death had been waiting quietly, unnoticed for years. When news broke, neighbors were stunned. Some said they had assumed the flat was empty. Others claimed they smelled something odd but thought it came from rubbish bins nearby. A few remembered hearing the constant drone of the television but dismissed it as background noise. No one had asked questions. No one had knocked. London is a city of anonymity. Neighbors can live wall to wall without ever learning each other's names. For Joyce, that anonymity had been both a shield and a coffin. The door that wouldn't open had kept her hidden for over 2 years. And when it finally did, it revealed not only a body but a haunting truth, that in the heart of a crowded city, it is possible to vanish completely. The discovery of Joyce Carol Vincent's body spread through the media like wildfire. The headlines were almost too surreal to believe. Woman found dead in flat 2 years after death. Body discovered beside wrapped Christmas presents. Death in the city, how did no one notice? Readers were stunned. How could this happen in modern Britain? How could a woman in her 30s, once vibrant and social, be reduced to a skeleton in a flat above a shopping center, forgotten for years? The story tapped into a primal fear, the fear of dying alone, unnoticed, unmissed. It was more than a tragedy. It was a mirror. Journalists dug into her past. Who was Joyce Carol Vincent? They discovered the outlines of her life, her Caribbean heritage, her mother's early death, her strained relationship with her father, her career at Ernst & Young, her glamorous brush with the music industry, her time in a women's shelter. But the more they uncovered, the more puzzling the picture became. How could someone who had once met Nelson Mandela, who had once been surrounded by friends, end up vanishing so completely? Theories abounded. Some blamed systemic failures, housing agencies that didn't check, neighbors who didn't question, a society too busy to notice the missing. Others pointed to her personal choices, her gradual withdrawal from family and friends. And then there were those who saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of modern isolation, where technology allows bills to be paid automatically and human contact becomes optional. Her family's pain was indescribable. Her sisters had searched for her. They had written letters, made calls, even hired a private detective. But when the detective traced her to a previous address, Joyce never responded. They assumed she had chosen distance. They never imagined she had been dead all along. For them, the news was not just a tragedy. It was a cruel revelation. All those years they had wondered why she didn't call, why she didn't visit, why she didn't let them in. Those years had been filled with silence because she was gone. Her father, who Joyce had once claimed was dead, had himself died in 2004, not knowing that his daughter had already predeceased him. The estrangement meant that neither knew of the other's fate. It was the kind of cruel symmetry only tragedy can create. The public reacted with a mix of horror and fascination. Some saw themselves in Joyce's isolation. Others recoiled from the idea that modern society could allow such a thing to happen. The story became a cultural talking point, a symbol of loneliness in the urban age. Documentaries and news specials dissected every detail. How had no one knocked on her door? How had benefits kept her flat going for years? How could neighbors ignore the smell of decay? Each question chipped away at the illusion of connection that city life promises. And yet, beyond the speculation, one haunting fact remained. Joyce was gone, and the world had moved on without her. Years later, filmmaker Carol Morley would create Dreams of a Life, a haunting docudrama piecing together fragments of Joyce's existence. Friends, ex-lovers, acquaintances, each remembered her differently. To some, she was vibrant, magnetic. To others, private, mysterious. No single portrait captured the whole truth. Perhaps that was Joyce's final legacy. She was a woman who had lived many lives, worn many masks, and in the end, slipped through the cracks. But in 2006, as the news of her discovery spread, Joyce's story was still raw, unresolved, impossible to process. Her flat had become a crime scene without a crime, a coffin without mourners. The wrapped Christmas presents sat as silent witnesses to the life she had once hoped to share. The humming television, still glowing after years, seemed almost accusatory. How many images had it played? How many shows had flickered past, while its owner lay unmoving beside it? The world reacted with shock, pity, and unease. But beneath it all was a chilling truth that lingered long after the headlines faded. Joyce Carol Vincent had been forgotten in life before she was remembered in death. The discovery of Joyce Carol Vincent's body in January 2006 triggered not just shock, but also a painstaking investigation. At first, the police treated the case like any other unexplained death. They sealed off the bedsit above the wood green shopping city, cataloged evidence, and set out to answer the questions that loomed. How did she die? When exactly did it happen? And why did no one notice? From the start, detectives were struck by the eerie normality of the scene. Unlike a typical unattended death, where chaos or decay dominates, Joyce's flat looked disturbingly ordinary, frozen in mid-action as if she had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. The heating still worked. The television glowed. The remote lay beside her. And then there were the Christmas presents. Wrapped neatly, ribbons intact, each a silent reminder that she had plans, intentions, a life still in motion. Pathologists were brought in, but the condition of her remains made their job nearly impossible. After 2 years, her body was mostly skeletal. The organs had long since decomposed, leaving little biological evidence behind. A full postmortem could not be performed. The medical team considered her medical history: chronic asthma, a recent hospitalization for a peptic ulcer, signs of past ill health. The official conclusion pointed toward natural causes: an asthma attack, a complication from her ulcer, perhaps both. The door was double-locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry or violence. No drugs, no alcohol bottles scattered, no evidence of suicide. If foul play had occurred, time had erased its traces. The police eventually closed the case with no suspicion of crime. But for investigators, the more unsettling questions were not about how Joyce died, but about how she remained undiscovered for so long. Detectives retraced her final years, piecing together fragments from social workers, housing records, and family testimony. The picture that emerged was one of gradual withdrawal. They learned that Joyce had resigned from Ernst & Young in 2001, a move she never explained. Shortly after, she had spent time in a women's shelter for domestic abuse survivors. From there, she drifted, brief jobs, temporary lodgings, before arriving at the Wood Green flat in February 2003. By November that same year, she had been hospitalized for vomiting blood, discharged after 2 days and sent home. Within weeks she was dead. Detectives also investigated why the system had failed her. Housing benefits had continued to cover half her rent, even after her death. The automated payments created the illusion of life. By the time arrears built to an undeniable £2,400, more than 2 years had passed. Neighbors too were interviewed. Some admitted they had smelled something strange, but assumed it was rubbish from the nearby bins. Others mentioned the constant drone of the television but didn't think to question it. In a noisy, transient building, nothing about Joyce's silence seemed unusual. It was anonymity that killed her, not in the literal sense but in the social one. She had disappeared into the cracks of the city, and the systems meant to protect her failed to notice. The investigation also touched on her family. Her sisters had been actively searching, hiring a private investigator and even contacting the Salvation Army for help. But because Joyce had left no forwarding information and ignored letters, their search had ended in frustration. Investigators found no evidence that Joyce had ever tried to reach back. She had vanished by choice or necessity. The detectives left with more questions than answers. The file was closed, but the story was unfinished. What haunted the investigators most wasn't just the death itself, but the context. Here was a woman who had once been radiant, social, even glamorous. She had attended concerts, mingled in the music world, shaken hands with Nelson Mandela. And yet, her end was lonely, anonymous, her body decaying in silence while the television filled the void. The case was technically solved. The conclusion: death by natural causes, no foul play. But emotionally, ethically, and socially, nothing was solved at all. Joyce's death was less a crime to be answered and more a mirror held up to society. The investigation left a chilling lesson. Sometimes the greatest mystery isn't how someone dies. It's how no one notices. When the police closed Joyce's file, the official story was simple. She had died of natural causes in December 2003. But for the public, the press, and those who knew her, the story was anything but simple. Her death raised questions that couldn't be answered by pathology reports or police files. They were bigger, messier questions about life, loneliness, and the world we live in. The first was the most obvious. How could no one notice? In an age when technology connects us more than ever, how could someone vanish in plain sight? Joyce had sisters, friends, neighbors, colleagues. She had once been part of vibrant circles. And yet, when she withdrew, the world let her go without resistance. Were people too busy? Did they assume someone else was checking on her? Did the silence stretch so long that reaching out felt impossible? The uncomfortable truth is that it's easier than we think. In a city like London, you can live surrounded by millions yet be invisible. Bills can be paid automatically. Rent can be deducted through benefits. Neighbors can dismiss strange smells or noises. A television can flicker endlessly, creating the illusion of life. All it takes is silence, and a person can vanish into the cracks of society. The second question was darker. Did Joyce want to disappear? She had withdrawn from her family. She had ignored letters. She had chosen not to re-establish contact after her time in the shelter. Did she feel shame about being in an abusive relationship? Did she fear being found by her abuser? Or was she simply tired of explaining herself, choosing solitude as a final refuge? Perhaps it was all of these at once. Shame, fear, and exhaustion can be powerful motivators. For Joyce, disappearing may have felt like control, a way to rewrite her story on her own terms. But in the end, her retreat became permanent, her silence unbroken. The third question went beyond Joyce. What does her story say about us? Her death became a symbol, a cautionary tale about modern isolation. Commentators saw it as proof of the dangers of urban life. Millions of people living side by side, yet strangers to one another. Others saw it as an indictment of bureaucratic systems that function without human oversight. The benefits kept her flat running, but no one asked why she never answered the door. Even her neighbors, who heard the television and smelled the decay, chose not to act. Was it apathy? Fear of intrusion? Or simply the assumption that someone else would handle it? In Joyce's story, the silence wasn't just hers. It was collective. Years later, filmmaker Carol Morley would create Dreams of a Life, piecing together testimonies from those who knew Joyce. Friends remembered her as magnetic, stylish, vibrant. Acquaintances described her as private, mysterious, difficult to truly know. Each account revealed a different version of her, yet none could explain how she ended up alone in that flat. Musician Steven Wilson was so moved by her story that he dedicated his 2015 album Hand Cannot Erase to her memory. For him, her life and death symbolized the fragility of human connection in a world that pretends to be endlessly connected. But even with films, songs, and articles, the core questions remain unanswered. Joyce's story resists closure. We don't know why she withdrew. We don't know if she wrapped those Christmas presents for others or for herself. We don't know what her final moments were like. Did she gasp for air during an asthma attack, reaching for her inhaler? Did she feel a sudden pain from her ulcer, collapsing before she could call for help? Or did she simply drift into unconsciousness, unaware that her retreat had become permanent? We will never know. And maybe that's the cruelest part of Joyce's story. The mystery isn't just in the death, it's in the life. Who was she really? Was she the glamorous friend on the music scene, shaking hands with Mandela? The efficient worker at Ernst & Young? The frightened woman in the shelter? The estranged sister? The invisible neighbor? The answer is all of them. And yet, none of them fully explain the woman who became the headline, "Woman Found Dead After 2 Years." The questions that remain aren't meant to be solved. They are meant to haunt us, to force us to look closer at the people around us. Joyce's story is less about her alone and more about the fragility of human bonds, the ease with which someone can slip away unnoticed, the silence that grows when no one breaks it. Because in the end, Joyce Carol Vincent wasn't just a woman who died alone. She was a reflection of what can happen when connection fails, when systems mask absence, when silence becomes the loudest sound of all. When the newspapers first reported Joyce Carol Vincent's story in 2006, the headlines were brutal in their simplicity: woman found dead after 3 years, body discovered with TV still on. The sensationalism was inevitable. After all, nothing grips the public imagination like a mystery that exposes our deepest fears of loneliness and invisibility. But with Joyce, the story didn't stop at headlines. It evolved into something larger. A cultural mirror, a symbol of what it means to live and die in modern society. The case reverberated far beyond the usual news cycle. It sparked conversations in homes, offices, pubs, and classrooms. People asked themselves uncomfortable questions. Would anyone notice if I vanished? Who would check if I stopped answering calls? How many of my neighbors' names do I actually know? Joyce became a shorthand for urban isolation, her name invoked whenever society tried to grapple with its fractured sense of community. One of the most significant cultural responses came in 2011, when filmmaker Carol Morley released Dreams of a Life. Morley had stumbled upon Joyce's story in a newspaper, and it haunted her. She set out to reconstruct not just Joyce's death, but her life, a portrait that would challenge the reduction of Joyce to a mere headline. The film blended interviews with Joyce's friends and colleagues with dramatized sequences, creating a narrative that asked as many questions as it answered. Old friends remembered her as luminous, magnetic, someone who turned heads when she walked into a room. Musicians recalled her backstage at gigs, stylish and mysterious. Coworkers described her as capable but guarded. The fragments formed a mosaic that suggested complexity. Joyce was not simply a recluse or victim, but a woman with layers, contradictions, and secrets. Audiences who saw the film left shaken. It wasn't just Joyce's death that disturbed them, it was the way the testimonies contradicted one another, leaving viewers uncertain about who she really was. That uncertainty was the point. Joyce, Morley suggested, was unknowable, and perhaps that was why she could vanish without anyone truly realizing she was gone. Music, too, carried her story forward. In 2015, progressive rock musician Steven Wilson released his album Hand Cannot Erase, inspired by Joyce's life and death. Wilson, struck by the surreal nature of her unnoticed passing, crafted an album that explored themes of disappearance, memory, and the fragile bonds that connect us. The record told the fictionalized story of a young woman in a city who slowly withdraws from the world, mirroring Joyce's trajectory. For fans, the album was devastating, a haunting meditation on invisibility in the digital age. For Wilson, it was a way of keeping Joyce's story alive, ensuring she would not be forgotten. But the cultural legacy of Joyce Carol Vincent wasn't limited to film and music. Academics, sociologists, and journalists began using her story as a case study. She became a symbol of social death, a term used to describe the condition of being ignored, unseen, erased by one's community long before physical death occurs. Her story raised debates about the role of technology. On one hand, technology had enabled her disappearance. Automatic payments kept her flat functioning, while the television created a facade of normality. On the other hand, technology also revived her memory. Through films, music, and endless online discussions, Joyce's story reached millions who had never known her in life. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of her cultural legacy is the way her story continues to resurface. Every few years, a new generation discovers her tale, usually through viral posts or re-airings of Morley's film. Each time, the reactions are the same: disbelief, sadness, self-reflection. People vow to check on their neighbors, call old friends, stay connected. For a brief moment, Joyce's life and death remind the world of its shared humanity. Of course, whether those promises endure is another question. But the fact that Joyce's story still resonates nearly 2 decades later is proof of its enduring power. She was forgotten once, but through culture she will not be forgotten again. Despite the investigations, the documentaries, and the songs, Joyce's story remains unfinished. And perhaps it always will. The truth is, we will never know the answers to the most haunting questions. What went through Joyce's mind in those final days? Did she anticipate death, or did it take her by surprise? Were the wrapped Christmas presents meant for reconciliation, or were they simply gifts she never had the chance to deliver? Did she want to disappear from her family's view, or did she quietly hope they might someday find her? The unanswered questions form a silence just as deafening as the television that hummed in her empty flat for 2 years. For her sisters, the story is deeply personal. They searched for her, hired investigators, reached out to organizations, yet they were powerless to breach the walls Joyce had built around herself. For them, closure will always be elusive. How do you grieve a sister who chose not to be found? How do you mourn when your only knowledge of her last years comes from secondhand reports and a flat frozen in time? For society, the story is broader. Joyce's death forces us to confront the fragility of human connection. In cities around the world, people live and die in silence every day. Most don't make headlines. Most aren't discovered years later with the television still on. But Joyce's story gives those silent disappearances a face, a name, a narrative. And yet, the story resists being tied up neatly. It doesn't offer a moral in the traditional sense. Instead, it lingers as a warning, a challenge. It dares us to ask, who in our lives could be drifting away without us noticing? Who is hiding in plain sight, silenced by shame, fear, or isolation? Perhaps the real tragedy is not just Joyce's death, but the countless other Joyces living behind closed doors right now. The unfinished story also belongs to Joyce herself. Because no matter how many films or songs are made, no matter how many articles dissect her death, we will never have her voice. We will never hear her side of the story, never know how she interpreted her own life. All we have are fragments, other people's memories, scattered documents, the mute testimony of a flat left behind. She remains, in some ways, a ghost, not just of a woman but of the questions we never asked until it was too late. And so Joyce Carol Vincent's story continues, not as a closed case, but as an open wound in the collective conscience. Her cultural legacy ensures she will not be forgotten, but her silence ensures she will never be fully understood. In that tension lies the enduring power of her story. It is both remembered and unfinished, public and private, haunting and inspiring. A tragedy, yes, but also a reminder. Because in the end, Joyce Carol Vincent forces us to look not at her, but at ourselves.